Okay, let me see if I can just share my slides. Can everybody see?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So yes, so today we're going to talk about bipolar disorder and creativity and the connection between them. And this is a really interesting area of research for me. It's something that I've kind of built up to kind of throughout my career. I started in bipolar disorder, and then I researched schizophrenia and psychosis. We've looked at cognitive deficits. We've looked at temperament measures that are underlying bipolar disorder, and they all kind of ended up connecting to creativity. And so I'm excited to share some of our new results with you that kind of built on the theories that I've previously published. So where I really wanted to start, though, to kind of set the stage is the magic button question. So I don't know how many of you have actually heard about this, but this was a question that was posed to several different groups at different times. And the question is, if there were a button that you could press that would take away your bipolar disorder, would you press it? And it's a simple question. And for most disorders, whether they be psychiatric illnesses or medical conditions, I think the resounding response would be yes, because no one wants pain or suffering, right? But the interesting thing with bipolar disorder is that over 333 people, 3,300 people were surveyed, and only 54% actually said yes. So those people said yes because of the negative aspects of the disorder, the cost that comes with it, the unstable relationships and negative view of self, financial instability, increased mortality, disability, stigma, and even suicide. But the other 46% of people chose to keep their disorders despite the cost that it came in their lives. And that's because it's also imbues many people with some positive aspects, one of which commonly cited is creativity, but there are others like empathy and resilience, increased productivity, confidence, social ease, and self-awareness. So this is pretty different for a complex disorder that people would actually choose to continue to have a disorder and to suffer the consequences of it because it's actually got some positives. I can't think of a single other disorder, maybe ADHD, which is not as severe as bipolar disorder, where we would get an outcome like this. And so I think that really kind of sets the stage for what we're talking about here. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I don't know why that's going off. I thought I muted it. So as we get into the study of creativity, I wanted to show this first because I think it really speaks to the uniqueness of bipolar disorder among other illnesses. So this relationship between creativity and bipolar disorder really dates back to the time of Aristotle. And there's been many investigations into this connection over the years in terms of biographical and population-based studies. And they've consistently supported this link between creativity and bipolar disorder and suggested that they track together in families. So among those that are eminently creative, it's been noted that there's an overrepresentation of mood disorders and psychosis. So these are the people like the Van Goghs of the world that achieved greatness and were renowned for their artistic talents, but also struggled with mental illness. It's also been noted that there's an overrepresentation of bipolar patients and their unaffected first-degree relatives in creative occupations in these very large population-based studies. So these are millions of people. And an overrepresentation of nearly tenfold, which is really quite high. It's much larger than one would expect. And so these studies really kind of demonstrate that there's some sort of a familial or genetic link between bipolar disorder and creativity. However, it's also been observed that higher creativity and success are really more prominent among the unaffected first-degree relatives of the patients than in the patients themselves. And creativity and eminence are also more associated with bipolar spectrum traits and schizotypal traits, which reflect the underlying genetic predisposition to bipolar disorder and psychosis, rather than associated with the state of illness itself. So collectively, these observations really suggest that there are aspects of the bipolar spectrum in terms of mood regulation and psychosis that are tied to creativity and provide an advantage in terms of creative achievement, but that as those expressions become more extreme in the context of illness, they tend to inhibit creative accomplishment. And so the shared vulnerability model has been proposed to explain this relationship of creativity with bipolar disorder, where creativity would increase with genetic risk for bipolar disorder up to a threshold. And then after that threshold is reached, the impact of illness and the severity of the symptoms would start to diminish creative accomplishment. And so then that creativity would decrease. And of course, when we're talking about genetic risk, we're not talking about really genetic risk for bipolar disorder itself, because bipolar disorder is a very complex construct. It's not one thing, it's a lot of things that come together under this umbrella of a single illness that can be expressed in so many different ways. So what we're really talking about is the genetic expression of traits that are underlying bipolar disorder, and probably quite a few of them that promote this higher creativity. So temperament is thought to be one of those bipolar spectrum traits that is related to creativity. It's related obviously to bipolar disorder. It underlies the trait expression, and it's related to creativity in bipolar disorder. These temperaments have also been suggested to be evolutionarily adaptive. And a similar model has been proposed for schizophrenia and schizotypal personality, which is kind of that underlying expression of psychosis. And of course, bipolar disorder has an aspect of psychosis to it as well. And so the thought is that these mild to moderate expressions of risk for bipolar disorder actually provide an advantage. So that the traits that are underlying the risk for bipolar disorder reach a threshold where they actually increase fitness in those who possess them. And these would be unaffected individuals who have these risk traits in a mild to moderate dosage. And that's where things like creativity and success would be promoted within this fitness level. But then as the expression gets higher, it leads to bipolar disorder, and we lose the fitness concept. Although some people with bipolar disorder are in fact creative, but perhaps they're not as successful as they would be if they weren't dealing with the illness on top of their creativity. And there's been quite a few genetic studies recently that have actually confirmed that there is this shared genetic vulnerability. And hopefully there'll be more genetic studies of this type in the future, but they are a little bit harder to do than your general case control bipolar, not bipolar study. So they're a little bit trickier, and the ones that have been published so far have been pretty small samples and need to be replicated. So the traits that have been suggested to lie within this this shared vulnerability space, the space between madness and genius, really relate to aspects of bipolar disorder. So for example, cyclothymic temperament, which is kind of this moodiness. It's kind of the ups and the downs, not extreme ups and downs, but just kind of, up and down, and this emotional intensity and having a wider range of emotion than the average. And this is really what we think of when we think of that artistic temperament, kind of that moodiness, and just really kind of having those more intense expressions of emotion. And it's been related to, in some small studies, it's been related to creativity. And it runs in bipolar families where the unaffected relatives have higher expressions of cyclothymic temperament, and it's heritable in those families as well. Hypomanic personality is another very bipolar trait. It truly is just the milder expression of hypomania. And I think, when you conceive of hypomania and what constitutes hypomania, you can see how many of those traits could really provide quite an advantage in terms of a higher mood and energy. kind of this propensity to take small risks, maybe not large risks, and be reckless, but small risk taking. So, and you need to take risks if you're going to be successful. And having that kind of, more spontaneous behavior and the self-confidence and the ease in social situations. And so that's actually been termed the hypomanic edge. And it's been suggested that that is one of the main components, not only of creativity, it's highly expressed in creative individuals, but also just a determinant of success in any realm, whether it's a creative or a business venture or what have you. Impulsivity here is kind of referencing more of the cognitive instability. So kind of the having a lot of thoughts and having a lot of different interests and changing them rapidly, and kind of a seeking of more stimulation and a bit of restlessness. And it's been suggested that impulsivity may relate to creative generativity, so being able to generate those novel ideas. And openness to experience is actually one of the hallmark qualities of a creative individual. This is really reflecting this kind of highly imaginative person with a lot of interests, like a breadth of interests and intellectual curiosity, who is also very tolerant of others and the views and opinions of others, and empathetic towards them. So of all the traits within the shared vulnerability space, openness is truly the most positive, because these, as you can imagine, in their extreme, lead to things like bipolar disorder, right? I mean, hypomanic personality in the extreme would be mania or hypomania. Cyclothymic temperament really is this kind of like mood regulation in bipolar disorder, and impulsivity is a hallmark feature of bipolar disorder. But openness, you can't really have too much openness and have it be a bad thing. It just means you're super imaginative and, like really caring person. And what is going on? Sorry, I don't know why my phone keeps going off. Sorry, I muted it and I don't know why it's still loud. So anyway, so openness is really quite the positive trait of all the traits, and it's been considered to be a hallmark feature of creativity, and really strongly correlated with creative performance. And it's noted to be elevated among bipolar individuals and their family members as well. And it's a heritable trait as well. Positive schizotypy is kind of that mild expression of psychosis. So in psychosis, we have the hallucinations and the delusions that are clearly dysfunctional. But in positive schizotypy, it really becomes more of an altered perception of the world and one's place in it. It becomes an openness to concepts like different types of ideas and magical thinking. So people that score higher on schizotypy tend to be kind of on the superstitious side. They tend to believe in the paranormal and UFOs, and be kind of open to these alternative concepts that maybe the norm of society doesn't buy into, but they're open to believing those kinds of things. So it's just a different way of perceiving life and thinking about things in a different way. It could also be more based in reality and how you actually visualize your environment and how you see yourself in it. And positive schizotypy is probably conferred by cognitive disinhibition. So cognitive disinhibition would be more of the biological process, whereas positive schizotypy is a personality trait. And in cognitive disinhibition, this is a term that's been used to describe the psychosis and also creative individuals in terms of extreme. So in psychosis, we all have this stimulus filter in our brain that helps us to filter out irrelevant stimuli, things that we don't need to attend to on a moment-to-moment basis. In schizophrenia, it's thought that that stimulus filter is completely fragmented. And so these irrelevant stimuli make it into the subconscious level, and they become misinterpreted as hallucinations and delusions. In the creative individual, it's thought that the stimulus filter is just a little bit leaky. And so they're not hallucinating, but more is coming into their awareness. And so perhaps they're able to see the world in a different way, maybe richer colors or spatial relationships that we don't see, a way of perceiving relationships between objects and ideas. And so really it's kind of the biological basis for many of these traits. And then related to that is conceptual over-inclusiveness. And so this is a concept where it's an ability to take kind of loosely related concepts and bring them together and find a connection. And so this is something that in terms of mania, we call it loose associations. But creative individuals, especially writers, exhibit it too. They're able to kind of connect seemingly disparate concepts and bring them together in a very novel way. And so they can produce these very original ideas that we then consider creative. So those are kind of the shared vulnerability traits, but it's also thought that creative individuals may have these kind of protective factors that would help them to take these kind of shared traits and take them into the realm of actual creativity. IQ is thought to be one of them. So intelligence is clearly related to creativity, but it's not highly related. It's actually pretty low to moderate correlation. And above the IQ of 120, it's been apparent that openness and other personality factors are actually much more predictive of creative potential. Cognitive flexibility is also thought to be relevant, being able to have a nimble mind and being able to work with concepts and put things together. And a positive mood has been shown to facilitate creative performance, whereas a negative mood tends to inhibit that creative thought. And so those are kind of the plus sides for creativity. And then these are the shared traits between bipolar disorder and creativity. And so now I want to show you some data that we have. So this was the theory, and then we were able to actually test this theory. And so we recruited a sample of non-creative controls, creative controls, and bipolar individuals. And we put them through this very long and very detailed battery, assessing many different things. So I'm just going to kind of pick and choose a few things today that relate to the shared vulnerability and those things that actually seem to really set the creative group apart from the others. So this is what the shared vulnerability traits look like in the creative individuals. So this is our non-creative cohort here. And as you can see, all the traits come to a point here, and that's by design. We wanted to be able to visualize all these different traits on the same scale. And we wanted to be able to relate the creative and bipolar groups to the non-creative group in a way that we can draw meaningful and comparative conclusions from the data. So we do that by setting the mean of the non-creative group to 0 and then relating everything else back to it. In doing so, we create effect sizes for these other groups, and we can compare them against established thresholds for what is considered significant, interesting, and meaningful. And so that's what these are here. These are the thresholds for small effects, medium effects, and large effects. And so you can see that in the creative group, these bipolar traits of hypomanic personality, cyclothymic temperament, and positive schizotypy, so the mood regulation and the kind of psychosis aspects are quite largely elevated in the creative group. So they really are expressing these bipolar spectrum traits at quite a high level compared to their non-creative counterparts. Openness is also significantly elevated in the creative individuals. And as I mentioned, this is a hallmark of creativity. So this was a very expected result, and it was good to see that it popped up there. Impulsivity hasn't been directly evaluated in creativity in very many studies. So this was kind of an interesting result to see that it is actually elevated in creative individuals, but the facets of impulsivity that were most related to creativity were that cognitive instability that I mentioned, the kind of overactive mind and changing interests, and also that little bit of motor restlessness. So not just impulsivity across the board, but just kind of those specific domains. Attention was only very moderately contributing to this result. And then finally, the hyperthymic temperament. So hyperthymic, unlike cyclothymic, which is kind of up and down and all over the place, hyperthymic is just a kind of baseline, general, positive, cheerful mood. And we see that that's elevated, not quite to the extreme extent that some of these others are, but it's elevated in the creative groups as well. And so that's probably helpful to them in terms of that creative process with the positive mood giving the fodder for creativity. So let's see what it looks like in the bipolar group. It looks like this. So as you can see, the scale has changed quite dramatically here on the side. So these are the original results in the creative individuals. And you can see here that in bipolar disorder, we do have the expected result for cyclothymic temperament, hypomanic personality, positive schizotypy, and impulsivity. These are extremely elevated in the bipolar cohort by twofold compared to the creative group, actually 2 orders of magnitude greater than the creative group. So these are very extreme results. And that's what you would expect, because as high as these were in the creative group, that was a moderate expression. So we expected that they would exist at the extreme in the bipolar group, and they do. So that was validating to see that. Openness is kind of interesting. So it was elevated with quite a large effect in the creative group as we expected. It was not quite as high in the bipolar group, but it still had a very significant elevation in the bipolar group compared to the non-creative group. So it's still suggesting that this is a trait that is associated with bipolar disorder. And this is the one that really kind of is that truly positive trait where, you know, it's imagination and empathy and tolerance and open-mindedness. And many people with bipolar disorder do view themselves as having those traits. And so I think that's why we're seeing that here. And finally, with hyperthymic temperament, the baseline positive mood, we do not find evidence for that in bipolar disorder. That's not surprising, because typically bipolar disorder exists up here with the cyclothymic and hypomanic temperament. So there is some of that high mood built into the hypomanic personality, but it's not that kind of baseline like cheerful. It's more of a intense high mood and a mood instability type of a trait, whereas in the creatives it's just kind of a generally upbeat, you know, glasses half full kind of mindset. So those are the personality and temperament traits. And we also wanted to look at cognition. And so we used a customized version of the computerized neuropsychological battery that was created by my colleague, Dr. Reuben Gur. And we wanted to not only look at general cognitive function, but really look at specific cognitive functions that may have a bearing on creativity. And so one of the things that was really key to look at was reasoning, and we looked at verbal and nonverbal reasoning. Nonverbal reasoning uses this kind of a matrix test. Some of this might be familiar to those of you if you've ever taken any kind of standardized IQ test. You often see matrix reasoning tests on there. I know my kids use this when they were tested for GATE. Mensa uses it. So it's really kind of a standardized part of an IQ test. And it is assessing fluid reasoning and problem solving ability, which are highly related to creativity. And so in this test, the participant is asked to fill in the blank of this array with one of the options here. And so that one's pretty easy. I think most people could fill that one in. They do get a lot harder. So it starts off easy, and then it's iterative in terms of getting harder and harder the more you get right. And then on the other side, we had the verbal reasoning, which used verbal analogy problems, where the participants were asked to kind of fill in the blank. Universe is to world as university is to class. And these two tasks were combined for an overall test or overall measure of reasoning ability and problem solving. We also looked at spatial processing ability, which intuitively would be very useful, especially to visual artists, being able to kind of easily imagine their environment. And so what this test is assessing is the ability to look at two lines presented at different angles and use these buttons here to rotate the blue one in order to become parallel to the red one, and do it with the fewest moves possible as quickly as possible. And finally, we included a test of declarative memory, and we used 3 different forms of this test that were then combined for a total memory summary score. In the verbal subtest, we presented 20 words and then asked the participant to memorize those 20 words, and then presented them again amongst 20 distractor words and asked how confident are you that you have seen this word before, and they would rate it on a scale. The test of shapes and faces was the same. And so that was our memory measurements. We also wanted to look at humor appreciation. This is a little bit novel. Not many people have studied this, but it has been associated with creativity. And so we again looked at verbal and nonverbal. And in the verbal, we used newspaper headlines, one of which contains a joke and one of which is kind of the more straight version. And for the nonverbal, we used Mordello cartoons, one of which contains a joke and the other one, the joke has been removed. And then they were simply asked to determine which one is funnier. And then these were combined for a total humor appreciation score. Okay, and finally, we wanted to look at creativity. So the creativity task had 3 verbal problems, one of which was product improvement. And they were given a little stuffed elephant and asked to list the cleverest and most interesting ways they could think to improve it so that it would be more fun for a child to play with. We asked them to list unusual uses for a common item, in this case, a cardboard box. And we included a just suppose task where a hypothetical situation is presented, and they are asked to come up with consequences of the hypothetical situation. So in this case, it was, what if clouds had strings? What would be the consequence? Sorry, lose my voice. Okay, so all of these were rated for fluency, the number of ideas, flexibility, the categories of independent ideas. So like with the elephant task, perhaps changing the color of the elephant versus having the elephant make some kind of a noise. Those would be 2 different categories of improvement ideas. And then of course, the originality or the uniqueness of all the ideas. So this is what the data looks like. So we can see that for the cognitive measures, the reasoning, spatial ability, humor appreciation, and memory, we see a cognitive enhancement that's prevalent among the creatives across all of these tasks. It's not nearly as large as we saw for the personality and temperament, but it is significant compared to the non-creative group. Also, interestingly, in the bipolar group, we did not see any cognitive deficits. So in some cases, deficits in certain cognitive functions have been seen in bipolar disorder in other studies, but these tasks are pretty directly related to creativity, and we don't really find a lot of evidence that there's a deficit here. I mean, the scores are a little bit lower, but that's not significantly different from the control population. Conversely, we see rather large increases in performance in the creative group for the divergent thinking tasks, or these outside of the box thinking tasks, and particularly in terms of originality. So the responses that were given by the creative group were particularly original. And interestingly, we do not see this kind of drop off in the bipolar group. They performed as well as the creative individuals. So whereas they didn't show the same kind of creative or cognitive enhancement that the creative individuals showed, they did see this enhancement in terms of their creative performance. So I think we've really kind of shown that all of those shared vulnerability traits do actually manifest the way that we thought they would, that they are present in a mild to moderate form in the creative cohort, and they're present for the most part at the extreme in the bipolar cohort. In terms of cognitive ability, we instead see just a particular enhancement in the creative group, and for the cognitive functions, and then an increase in creativity in both groups. And so we're really kind of starting to see that inverted U model appear with these data. And so this is just kind of a different type of representation of that shared vulnerability, breaking it down into a little bit more meaningful traits versus saying openness and positive schizotypy. There are multiple facets of each of these traits, and I didn't show those data because it's a little bit too complex. But these are the types of specific aspects of these overall concepts that were endorsed by both groups and can be considered shared traits. So it's this kind of changeable affect and emotional intensity and range of emotion. Excuse me. I guess I'm not used to talking this much. And in terms of behavior and personality, that kind of aspect of impulsivity, the spontaneous, overindulgent, restless, and changing interests. In terms of openness, is that imaginative mind and an interest in art and music, being empathetic and tolerant of others' beliefs. And in terms of cognition, having this altered perception of the world and their place in it, and an enhanced flow of ideas, abstract thinking, and originality. So this is really that definition of that shared vulnerability. And I've arranged it this way because when you look at some of those other traits, the cyclothymic, the hypomanic, openness, positive schizotypy, there are aspects of them that overlap. And so I think it's kind of interesting to break these down into things that are more related to mood, more related to behavior, and more related to cognition. And then, of course, on the bipolar side, at its extreme, we see those elements of the symptoms that are associated with bipolar disorder, and then and many of which represent these shared traits at the extreme, some of which are novel. And in creativity, we see that positive mood that's unique to the creative cohort. These also see themselves as intellectually curious and inventive. And then those cognitive enhancements and some richness of detail that came out of the divergent thinking tests. Their responses were as original as the bipolar cohort, but when they developed them more, they were kind of more detailed of a concept. And so that was kind of interesting. So just to kind of put this into context, I think that these results do have some implications in terms of the treatment of the illness. One big problem with bipolar disorder is noncompliance. And that's not just among those who are creative, it's actually among most people with bipolar disorder, because there's this tendency to take medication, and of course it has side effects, and to stop taking the medication when they feel better. And it just doesn't really work that way. It doesn't work that way for other disorders either. Any kind of medical illness, like if you're on medication to control some sort of a symptom, you have to kind of just stay on that medication. But because bipolar disorder has a very different presentation, there is this tendency to stop when you're feeling better. And for those who are creative, it's even worse because the medications often limit their creativity, or they feel like they do. And so there's this tendency to discontinue medications or to change their dose in order to try to achieve some of that mood variability without being too, having the really large mood swings. And that doesn't work very well either. And many just find it, the hypomania at least, to be very enjoyable and to help them in their creative work in terms of idea generation and productivity. And so they choose to just not be medicated. But unfortunately, the disease comes at a cost, and the symptoms tend to worsen quite a bit over time. And if it's untreated, the suicide rate is quite a bit higher. And so, we have to keep in context that this is a serious illness for which some form of treatment is required, whether it be medication, psychotherapy, the combination of the two. And I know a lot of people try to manage it with lifestyle changes, which sometimes works for some that have a less severe presentation. but there needs to be some form of treatment and a sustained form of treatment. And so the hope is that by studying this connection of bipolar disorder and creativity, we might be able to make headway towards personalized treatment options. Some of these shared vulnerability traits actually might lend themselves to things like cognitive therapy that would allow us to enhance those positive attributes, and then using medication to limit the mood swings. So having this understanding that some people really experience these positive benefits and it's not all negative, and being sensitive to that, I think clinicians might be able to find ways to work with these patients so that they can really, enjoy those positive aspects without having the mood swings destroying their life. Also, the thought is that because this connection is kind of a novel area of research, we don't know a lot about it, we might be able to use that connection to understand more about the biology underlying the illness. And then that would provide novel targets for treatment in terms of not only cognitive therapy, but also in terms of medication. It may suggest molecular pathways that could more easily be targeted with medications that have fewer side effects. And really the side effects is a large part of the problem with noncompliance. And finally, I think that if we can acknowledge that there are these positive aspects to this illness that is very different from other illnesses, and it's a reason why people would choose to actually have this experience of bipolar disorder when given the choice, I think that could help reduce stigma. And also appreciating that these positive aspects really derive from normal population variation in mood, temperament, personality, and cognition, and cognitive perceptual experiences. So things that are normally distributed in the population and may exist at the extreme in bipolar disorder, understanding that somewhere in there might hold an advantage for some people, and that's why it's in our population. I think that could go a long way towards alleviating some of the stigma. So I just want to quickly acknowledge some of my collaborators. John Kelso was my mentor in grad school, and we've continued to work together over the years. And this is really where my desire to study creativity came from. It's all those conversations about bipolar disorder and temperament and creativity that inspired this line of research. And Ruben Gur, who I've worked with for many years in schizophrenia and cognitive dysfunction, and who designed this cognitive battery so we could look at potential enhancements in this context. And then my wonderful staff and students who really persevered and get this study done in a very short time period with very limited funding. I could not have done that without them. And then I'll just leave you with some quotes from some people who have kind of struggled with this, this topic of whether or not to medicate and damage their creative expression. And also just an interesting quote from someone who participated in another facet of our study, looking at the experience of bipolar disorder and kind of noting that it's kind of funny that we're even talking about whether it's a question of keeping the disorder or choosing to give it up. That's very unique to bipolar disorder. So I thought that was a really interesting quote from her. So thank you. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? You guys are quiet. No questions?
No. I think it was a really well put out presentation that really explained what was going on, and I really appreciate Dr. Greenwood's time today.
Thank you.
So I do have a question. My hand is up.
You're welcome.
So what I was wondering is, what group of people did you first use for those 3,300 people that you said that they were bipolar, and a certain 46% would choose to stay bipolar and the other ones would choose not to? What group of people did you use for that research?
That actually wasn't my research study. That was done by the Bipolar Foundation. It was an online survey that they conducted in 2008.
So they were,
So-
it was a self-selected sample of
Yeah,
all American people.
right. So I think they just put it out to anyone who was interested in bipolar disorder. So of course there could be a bias in terms of the people who actually answered it. But I think at least that study was relatively large. Some of the other studies, they only asked people who had achieved a lot of success and they all said no, that they wouldn't push it because they felt that, you know, being bipolar had given them their success. So that was a really biased sample.
Okay, yeah.
I would note that, so actually this quote here from Sammy, of the study, my study that I just showed you, where we had 135 people with bipolar disorder, we actually reached out to more than half of them and asked them to participate in a secondary study. And we did this during the pandemic. as it turned out, the timing was kind of interesting. They were all home, and so they, you know, had nothing else to do. So it was kind of fun. And we had the same results. It was about 51% would push the button, 49% would not push it. And the interesting thing I thought, because I was like, oh, it has to be all the creative individuals that wouldn't push the button. And it wasn't. The creative individuals were actually split about 50-50. So there was no relationship to whether they were creative or not creative. And overwhelmingly, the reason that they said they would not push the button was that this illness has made them who they are. And it has given them creativity, even if they weren't, you know, a creative individual in a creative profession. They felt creative, and they felt that it had made them an individual, and it made them empathetic, and it had made them, given them greater awareness and understanding, not only of themselves, but of humanity. And so it was really interesting. It was very philosophical, why they chose not to push the button, but it was a similar result. So a selected sample again, but kind of interesting.
Chris, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to know how the creatives were chosen, what the standards were for being one of the creatives.
Sure. So we recruited creative individuals just through flyers. We attended some art fairs and music festivals and things like that. And then word of mouth kind of spread the study. Actually, somehow it went viral on Facebook. And so we started getting calls from all over the world and had people flying in from different places just to come participate because they thought it was fun. And so they were required to have been employed in a creative profession in order to be included in that creative group. In the non-creative group, they could not have been employed in a creative profession.
Okay.
And
I was
we looked
curious
at
about that.
achievement too. I didn't present these results, but we did look at achievement. So we actually have a lot of data.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about your bipolar cohort? Were they in creative professions, any of them, or you don't?
So we didn't restrict it. What we did was just advertised for people with bipolar disorder, and that was it. We didn't tell them that we were going to be looking at creativity. Over the course of an interview, we found out that about a third of them actually were creative to varying degrees. So some of them are highly, highly creative. Some of them, yeah, a little bit, but they are functioning in a creative profession. Interestingly, of the creative controls that just came by flyer, those flyers did not reference bipolar disorder, mental health, anything. We just said we're looking at creativity. And we got a good portion of responses from people who were bipolar. So we brought them in.
I wondered if that had happened.
Yeah, it was, you know, in a way, it was very validating that this is really a connection. I mean, it was quite a bit of people that came in being creative. And so they just got put into the creative or into the bipolar category. So, I mean, I didn't have time to present these data, but it kind of concerned me that maybe the creativity results in the bipolar cohort were from just those creative individuals. And so I actually went back and removed and split the bipolar cohort into creative and non-creative. And the results remain, of course, the creative ones did a whole lot better on the creative tasks and had higher achievement. But even those who were not creative still outperformed the controls in terms of their creative performance. They actually even had higher creative achievement. I mean, it wasn't really high, but they had done little stuff here and there.
Right.
And they were still more open. So they still embodied these creative characteristics, just maybe not quite to the extreme.
And can I ask one more thing? I didn't see a whole lot about the phases of bipolar and how that affected creativity, just whether they were medicated or not, a little bit, but what happens with mania, hypomania, and depression with the creativity.
Right. So because this was a smaller study, we actually required them, the bipolar cohort, to come in a euthymic state or as close to their personal baseline as possible. So we really didn't have anyone that was in a depressive episode or in a manic episode or even in an acute hypomanic episode. Some of our participants were kind of a little bit high as their baseline. That's just how they always were. And for them, we would hold them off and then reassess until we were confident that that's just who they are. And so then they participated, but the vast majority were euthymic. So just at a baseline mood. And they were all relatively high functioning. That's the other thing that I should mention. I think that could be why we don't see any cognitive deficits. Not all of them were employed, but they were all functioning at a level that didn't indicate too many disabling symptoms at that time. So, because part of it is we were asking them a lot of questions that required insight. And they really needed to understand their disorder, who they were. They needed to be able to perform in a cognitive setting, and the creative battery is a little bit complicated. So we needed them to be kind of at a certain level. So these aren't like highly performing people, but they're fairly well educated. They all at least have completed high school, most have completed college. So they really are kind of a not maybe your typical bipolar group.
Thank you.
How did you define creative job? And so I imagine there's musician, author, dramatist, etc. But with writer, there are all kinds of different writers, some of whom some people believe are more creative than others. Where did you break the line?
In terms of writing, I mean, for the most part, the writers that we have participated were novelists or poets.
Okay.
We had a lot of visual artists, painters, photographers, graphic designers, costume designers. We had musicians. In terms of musicians, we really didn't want it to be just someone who could play an instrument, because that's more of a proficiency thing. So we were looking for people who actually had achieved something novel. They had written a song, composed a piece of music. They were performing as a professional musician in a band, those kinds of things, rather than just, hobbyists. So I will say that even in the non-creative control group, we had people that had creative hobbies. They just didn't have much achievement. So when there's a creative achievement questionnaire that we use to kind of define achievement. And we can kind of even refine the creative group based on that, based on higher achievement. But regardless, the achievement in the creative group was much higher than the non-creative. I mean, they all had something that they were doing and could show progress in terms of achievement, not just like, oh, yeah, I paint, okay, but I don't do it professionally. So these were all people that were professionally making a living as a creative individual.
Good. Okay.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, Dr. Greenwood.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone.
We really appreciate you taking your time today. So if that's it, thank you all for participating. And again, thank you, Dr. Greenwood.
Thank
Very
you.
well.
Well, have a good night.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.